Hi, you two. This week we're learning more about water and why it's so important, and you will be making your own rain gauge at home. Now, I figured it would be fun for you to find out a little bit more about why someone would ever use a rain gauge. So, over the weekend, I interviewed my dad because he was a farmer and he used a rain gauge quite often. So let's get into the interview so that you can find out a bit more about why someone would use a rain gauge.
I'm Mr. Emerson. I'm Miss Emerson's dad. A rain gauge is an instrument that is used to measure the amount of rain that falls. It has to be a specific size so that it's consistent with everybody else's rain gauge. So your next door neighbour's reads exactly the same amount as your gauge does. I've used a rain gauge because I'm a farmer, and when I was on the farm, rain is very important and how much you get in order to go and plant crops or for your grass to grow, these sorts of things. And it also is used so you can measure the frequency of rain, because you can't remember if it rained last month or it rained 6 weeks ago. It's very hard to remember the date that it rained. Yes, this is the centrepiece, which has lines on it which gives measuring in millimetres. It sits in the middle. Now, of course, it'll get in the middle. You put this little piece on the top, which sits into the centrepiece, and when the rain falls, it falls into the top and goes into the centrepiece. If the centrepiece becomes full, it spills over the edge and fills the rest of the gauge, outside of the gauge. I used to have my rain gauge tied to a fence in the front of my house where it had no interference. There were no trees around it, no buildings around it, nothing that could interfere with the amount of rain that went in the top of the gauge. It's very important to have them clear standing where there's nothing around them. If it was raining, I used to check the rain gauge every morning it rained. So if it rained today, I would check it tomorrow morning. We had a chart that had dates on it. It had months, dates, and days on it, and all you did is just put the amount of rain you had in it, and the rain is measured in millimetres. The major thing that's interesting is that if you put a rain gauge in your garden and your friend puts a rain gauge in their garden and they say live a kilometre or a kilometre and a half away from you, the amount of rain in each gauge will differ. That's the first thing. The second thing is that depending upon how you make the rain gauge depends upon what your measurement is going to be. So if you want to make rain gauges, be consistent in your rain gauge. One of the things is you go to a school where you're very lucky because you can see what happens when it rains. And if it rains heavily in a catchment area, you can't go to school because the Georges River, which your school's on the edge of it, all floods. Now that's because you get huge amounts of rain in the Georges River catchment. The farm we had was a large farm, and if you put a rain gauge on one corner of the farm and put another rain gauge on the other corner, which would have been about 3 or 4 kilometres away, and it was on a dead flat plain, the rain in each gauge varied dramatically periodically, particularly if you have a storm. Like one gauge would get the storm and the gauge would be overflowing, the other gauge would have no rain in it because it didn't rain a kilometre away. it's important for life. On the farm, in order to grow crops, in order to raise cattle so that you could get cornflakes, wheat bix for breakfast, and so that you could put meat on the table to eat, you had to have rain. For people who live in cities, it's exactly the same. Is you need water to survive. And in Australia, which is the driest continent on Earth, next to Antarctica, it's vitally important that we conserve water and that you think about what you're doing every time you use water, because it's an important resource that you can't replenish, even though it does tend to replenish itself anyway, but you can't replace it if you use huge amounts of it, which is why we had water restrictions a short time ago, and we were very lucky because it rained and filled the dam up, so they've gone away. But in your lifetimes, that may not happen.